Yields back. Chairman Schiff.
Thank you. Just want to follow up on a couple issues. First of all, are you seeing a rise in death threats against school board members?
I can't necessarily quantify it, Mr. Chairman, but we are definitely seeing online activity which specifically calls for acts of violence being directed at teachers, school administrators, and school board members.
And those threats of violence are against those school personnel over, for example, decisions they're making about the health of the children in those schools?
Yes, it's included in a narrative that we have seen continue, which focuses on public health and other restrictions associated with COVID and having to do with vaccines as well.
Now, I know a lot of us on this podium have been the subject of death threats. When we are, those are investigated by Capitol Police, sometimes by federal law enforcement. We certainly want them investigated. You would agree, I assume, that death threats against school board members should be investigated similarly?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it's a fundamental part of our responsibility is to make sure that we take seriously threats of violence, and until we can determine that those threats are not valid or credible, to maintain and be vigilant to prevent acts of violence.
And these threats of violence, these death threats, are designed to try to force a change in policy, are they not?
The narratives that we have examined, that I have looked at, have specifically called for acts of violence as a result of policies that are being instituted in schools. I'm not sure I'm comfortable saying what the intent of the poster is, but the content has complained about the provisions and have called on people to threaten or to engage in violence against those school administrators, school board members, law enforcement, and healthcare professionals.
We're also seeing threats of violence against elections officials, are we not?
Yes, we have seen threats against election officials. We saw that in the 2020 election, and we continue to see it today.
I raise this because I think there's been a proliferation of threats of violence, politically motivated violence, and to an astonishing and dangerous degree, a rationalization of violence or threats of violence to bring about political change, an acceptance of political violence. And I would just point to the executive summary by the ODNI of the domestic violent extremist threat, which reads in part, newer socio-political developments such as narratives of fraud in the recent general election, the emboldening impact of the violent breach of the U.S. Capitol, conditions related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and conspiracy theories promoting violence will almost certainly spur some domestic violent extremists to try to engage in violence this year. Those who are pushing the big lie, undermining our democracy, are emboldening impact of the are emboldening new violence, in my view. Those who are downplaying the significance of the attack on January 6th, or trying to make political heroes of those who assaulted police officers on that day or breached the Capitol, in my view, are encouraging further violence. When we propagate a falsehood about the election, when we diminish public confidence in our elections, if people don't think they can rely on our elections to decide who should govern, it's an invitation to violence. And it's no better, indeed, I think it's far worse when that invitation to violence comes from members of Congress than anyone else. Because the members of Congress know that the big lie is a big lie. And I think it's shameful when we are informed by our intelligence agencies that that attack is emboldening others to commit other acts of violence, and when those false narratives of fraud in the election are also an encouragement to further violence, that members continue to engage in that. And I wanted to put that on the record. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you both for your attendance and participation.